Good evening and welcome again to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. If you tolerate me on Twitter, then you know what to expect. My co-host and partner in crime is Alex Suarez, and Alex had a close call today that he's going to talk about a little later. And our guests tonight are John Urquhart of Wales, the founder of Harmony Party UK, and my friend, theorist and raconteur Lenny Liebman from New York City. And we're going to talk about revolutionary theory and a few other things that dovetail into that. And we're also going to try to talk about better economics, because let's face it, folks, we all know this sucks, right? How are you doing tonight, Lenny?
I'm doing very well, staying out of the heat, and happy to be here with three comrades, plus whoever else is joining us online.
I'm always glad to be joined. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, though it's 2:39 in the morning here in the UK, so I might be a little bit tired.
You're an owl. You're a nocturnal owl.
Yeah, somewhat.
I really appreciate you being willing to stay up like this, John. The last time I did a show with someone in the UK, I ended up doing it at like 11 a.m. on a Sunday. And I try not to be doing anything at 11 a.m. on a Sunday. It's just a rule.
Do they do brunch there? Is that a thing in the UK? Brunch?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that
was an American invention.
Yeah, the Hobbits in Lord of the Rings were like 13 meals a day.
And that was based straight from country England.
Third breakfast.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they don't have a big American breakfast. It's good in three.
Admittedly, I don't eat quite as much in terms of size as perhaps Americans do. But although, having said that, my dad used to love telling this story of when he was in America, because he was doing some. He was quite weird. He was at times he was a sort of hippie communist, and at other times he was an evangelist. So anyway, in his evangelist phase, when he was in America, he supposedly went to this diner, and they gave him this huge plate of food, which apparently he was expected not to finish because he was British, and he had two of them and stunned everyone. I don't know how true that story was, but it's a fun story all the same. I don't believe it.
So the reason that I've got the panel I've got tonight is I want to talk about revolutionary theory. I'm very interested in revolutionary theory myself, and I tend to read a lot of different sources. Alex, of course, is a Trotskyist. John is an anarchist like myself, and Lenny is eclectic like myself, and has some ideas on how we can add a little bit and understand Marx in more modern terms, I guess is the best way to put it. Do I have that right?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind that characterization. I think, as you know from our previous interactions, that rather than characterize myself with something that has a name in it, whether it's Marx or Trotsky or Bakunin or anybody else, I kind of just like to consider it anti-capitalism and kind of leave it at that. And then that encompasses a variety of the reason I like, and I really push for the term anti-capitalist, because I think it's both sufficiently inclusive at the same and sufficiently exclusive, right? So one of the problems I have with the idea of the left is the left seems to include a lot of people who have positions other than the fact that capitalism is, sort of systemically and structurally the problem that must be overcome. A lot of the left wants to ameliorate the problems of capitalism somehow with something that they may or may not call socialism, but won't fundamentally agree that capitalism itself is at the root and therefore must go because we have a class, race, intersectional struggle.
Lenny, let me ask you something about bourgeois reform, right? So the other day I was talking to the member of the working class. They were not politically informed, but they wanted to know my views. And I put it very simply. I said, I want the workers to run everything. And then when they asked me about corporations and, do we need to curtail this? Do we need to curtail that? I said, they shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
That's what it comes to the difference between a reformist and a revolutionary.
Let me just complete my thought. So
Yeah.
what we want to do is, I think, just for clarity, we want to both exclude, again, the term leftist to me is, it's 200 years old and it can mean anything. There's a lot of other words we have like that. It's like it's if you say somebody's a good person, or if you say somebody's a religious or Christian. These are all sort of labels we use that don't mean anything, because you can have two people who are completely different from each other, both self-identifying a certain way.
And let's be honest, how many Christians are really Christian?
Well, according to Nietzsche, only one, and he died on the cross. So
didn't Marx said I'm anything but a Marxist?
Well, this is the thing, right? Nobody is an ism of themselves. So when we say anti-capitalism, we can exclude the left that isn't allied with a core objective on which we need to agree.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can be inclusive enough that people who, whether they identify as neo-Marxists or Marxist-Leninists, or even don't necessarily want to identify with a specific, a Middle European intellectual of the 19th century, it's still inclusive because we share the goal of anti-capitalism. And I think it was St. Augustine, in talking about theology, he says, in trivial matters allow disagreement, and in core matters agree, right? So we have to have some demarcation. So Alex, I don't mean to interrupt your question, but basically that's why I choose to identify the way I do. And I think it's a useful term more broadly that I push for. And, you can go to my Substack, and I have something very specific about why I think identifying as an anti-capitalist is kind of useful to avoid sectarian disagreements internally, while at the same time making sure we exclude people who can't possibly be allies because, as Alex, you say, they're bourgeois reform.
Well, I'm an anti-capitalist too. I'm anti-corporatist, but this is why I disagree that there shouldn't be too much emphasis on it. Because to further my comment that I was making earlier, when you're talking to the masses, they want to hear about solutions. They want to hear pro, not just anti. They want to hear what's the alternative, what's the society that you're trying to build.
I'm going to stop you, and I'm going to say, is that really true? And if it is really true, can you explain the Republicans and the Tories and the whack jobs?
When I'm talking about the masses, I'm talking about the masses that are fed up with the politicians.
Sure.
That never have solutions.
But so here's the thing. The late David Graeber recently had a book posthumously published with his colleague.
I have
David
that book open right now, funnily enough.
The Dawn of Everything, in which they point out correctly, if you really think about it long enough, that people define themselves in groups by what they're against more than by what they're for. I believe that the best example of this can be seen in American parochial politics, where prior to the moral majority in the 1980s, abortion was seen by most people as a Catholic issue. And Protestants were either moderately and quietly pro-abortion or didn't care about the issue because they defined themselves as Protestants. And what are Protestants? Anti-Catholic. They're against Catholicism and hierarchy. And
the problem with having the tent too big is you're going to do what MPP's doing, right?
Oh, no,
we're all anti-capitalist here at MPP.
That's why
you right-wing libertarians who also say they're anti-capitalist.
But they're not.
Even though a lot of them are pro-capitalist, really. They have
no right-wing libertarian.
And a lot of them
say they were anti-capitalist.
Yeah, I'm going to back you up there for a second, Chris, and just say that I agree very much, Alex, that people do want to know what you're for. But also from a perspective of revolutionary theory, if you look at our revolutions historically, for example, let's just look at the American Revolution, right? The key trigger point was we don't want to be under British rule. There hadn't even been a constitution. There was really no theory of a constitution, states' rights, representation, all that. So all of that wasn't even written yet, and yet people knew what they wanted to be thrown off.
Well,
let me put a second part on that, which is to say also, while we might theorize about what we believe the future should be, I'm extremely skeptical about anybody being able to, in fact, bring that into being. So when I hear different people theorize about the future, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the discussion and discourse we can have about it. But the reality is that we're not sure what we'll be able to bring about, especially when it comes to, anarchism, until we've actually got our hands on it. And I don't think
we have to define capitalism, because anybody can say, I'm anti-elite, I'm anti-rich, therefore I'm anti-capitalist, but then they're going to advocate. They have that rhetoric.
I think it's very easy to define capitalism. I mean, it's the use of aggregated capital power in society in order to extract surplus value from the proletariat. I mean,
but not only should we define capitalism while saying we're anti-capitalist, we should define what is a better alternative system to replace it.
Yeah, I just disagree with that, but that's okay.
I think people are not just hung up on what. I think Graeber was right in that people define themselves by what they're against, but they want you to define yourself by why you want change, not what change you want.
Yeah.
So you said about the Republicans and the Tories, and if you want another example, you can look at corporations, which is Apple, right? Yeah. The way that they reach people is that they say that they have the same why as you. The reason why they want you to listen to music, the reason why they want this policy. They don't say, this is what we're going to do. They tell you about it after they've done it, more than that. Yeah. So if we're going to reach people, it's not enough to know where we want to go. We want to know we need to know why we want to go there, and we need to communicate that first. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of the golden circle or not, where you start from why and move to what. Yeah. But that's what we need on, whether you want to call it the left or anti-capitalist movements or socialist tendencies, whatever we want to call it. That's the change I think we need most, is to talk about why first.
And I also think I think it's very, very important, and this is why, and this is one of the things I was looking forward when Chris asked me to join, is that I think something that we sometimes neglect, besides just what we're against and what our vision of what the mechanics might be of the future, is I think everybody, whether they do it consciously or not, has an underlying metaphysic. Everybody is a philosopher. Everybody believes the world is a certain way. And one of the issues with transitioning, as we would want to in a revolutionary period, from basically, let's say, is a hyper-individualistic, let me get mine and exploit the system in order to get what I want, and everything collective is an externality, to go from that hyper-individualistic mode to go to more of a collectivist idea is, to me, is you have to have some underlying view of the world that rationalizes a collective and communal way of being. In other words, if you believe that ultimately I am this thing inside this phlegm bag of flesh that operates separately and has its own mind and its own bank account and its own agendas, and that's where the world begins and ends, you're going to have trouble transitioning people who have that mindset into one where we live in a world of mutual aid, of what we call in Latin the summum bonum, the best for all. Yeah. And so I agree very much, John, with this idea that it's sort of, why do you want to change? And I think the part of the why that's very important to me and that's tangible is that right now life is really good for us. And this is where, Occupy Wall Street was great, right? Well, life is really good for the 1%, and the rest of us are maybe the 1% is really good. Somewhere there's another percentage, but a lot of us are getting shit on the regular because the system is structured to extract our blood and our life and our energy and our being from us, and to leave us with nothing because we exist only as an instrumentality of wealth extraction.
Lenny, I had a question for you.
Let me just finish the sentence.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sentence, and then you could. And yep. I said, so I think part of what people want to understand is that when we speak to people, And I would call them personally people, not masses, because we're all individual human beings with our own individual subtleties and distinctions and idiosyncrasies, is what we envision is a world in which people, a mass of people, don't have to live as the resource for a small group of people. And it's not so much that we want to get rid of the elites or we want to, terms like proletariat. It's that we believe that human beings fundamentally are better off if we're all better off, and that everybody should have a chance to thrive and vibe and not simply exist, again, as instrumentalized units for extraction of surplus value by financiers. I mean, so I don't think it's that hard to articulate, but I do think that in a world where everybody's trained to think of themselves as having their own identity, as having their own Twitter handle, as having their own social security number, as having their own bank account, as having their own story and their own intersectionalized identity, that to understand that we really are a collective. Humankind is like a coral reef. We are really not individuals. Nobody exists as an individual. And I think a picture of the future where there's this thing called the summum bonum, the collective benefit, the better life for all, is not a bad way to pitch the transition from capitalism, which we'll define as fundamentally extractive by aggregated capital, right? Aggregated capital extracts value from the masses for its own enrichment and exercises class power on that basis, to a world in which everybody can do for everybody else. I mean, it's a basic vision of equality and freedom.
In plain English, we want the rich to stop stealing from the rest of us to stay rich.
Well, also, he mentioned Occupy earlier. And as you know, Chris, I was a part of that movement. I would like to say we accomplished a lot, but we didn't. The only thing we really accomplished with Occupy was a change of narrative. That's it. Because we did not take political power. We didn't do what we did in Spain. In Spain, with Podemos in March 2011, with Indignados, the Indignados movement, which merged before Occupy out of Arab Spring in Spain, they formed the Podemos party later and took power. Several mayors, even the vice president of Spain recently, were of the Podemos party, which was a leftist party made out of protesters, protesting very similar things that they were doing during Occupy. And there was a refusal at Occupy to make a political party, to seize political power, and to offer a political alternative. Instead, you had these coalition groups come in, and then the reformists, like always, that infiltrated. And so because they said they're only anti and they're not pro anything, all they ever accomplished was a change of narrative, which is significant, but not significant enough.
And that's the problem with Extinction Rebellion, too, for who I have
they're not anti-capitalist.
But
I have friends.
They are nonpartisan.
I have friends who were involved in the core committees in XR in the UK, and XR's problem is one of democracy. Yeah. They've been heavily infiltrated, for one thing, which obviously always happens. You've got to be prepared for that.
They're similar to
but what's worse with XR is because they went with sortition as a sort of operating model. What's been a major problem for them is that the people who started it, who've still got authority in the movement, right, where they weren't in the committees they wanted to be in, they've still exercised huge control over them, and they've still basically run the whole thing.
But look at their narrative. They talk about corruption in the corporations. What they should be talking about is abolishing the corporations and going after capitalism and providing
I agree 100%. And everybody in the UK I know who is involved in XR has drifted away over the last 12 months. Not entirely, like they're still willing to do action with them, but there's very few people who I know who are organizing with them still, and that's because
it's because of
anti-corruption. That's it.
I'm gonna
throw.
They're not pro anything really.
I'm going to throw some shade at someone for whom a lot of people have a lot of respect, and for who I have a lot of respect for as a journalist and a thinker. But Chris Hedges is wrong about some basic ideas in his theory of revolution. Some of these have things directly to do with Occupy and a famous correspondence in a sort of post-mortem of Occupy between Hedges and the late David Graeber. where Graeber was very much taking a partisan, anti-capitalist, pro-Antifa, pro-Black Bloc kind of approach to revolution.
Chris Hedges is very anti-Black Bloc. I don't know about Antifa.
And Chris Hedges, he's written some bad things about Antifa too.
I didn't know that.
It's not his best subject.
Yeah.
It's comfortable white menitis. I mean, I hate to say it, if someone so
I never heard it put that way
in our stratosphere, but he can afford to be nonviolent. Damn it!
Yeah. So this is, and this may be segging into another.
It's impossible to be violent against the state. They have the monopoly of violence.
Exactly.
With resistance.
So
we were talking about this earlier on in a meeting. I was in like a book reading group, and one of the things that came up was that the futility of large scale violence against the state in America and Britain. Going to war with the state, it's not really a serious option. You would need a significant amount of the armed forces on your side first, and if you had that, you probably wouldn't need to go to war with the state.
well,
So like,
Well, look at the Viet Cong.
I can
They're
see
running
the
around
argument.
with AK-47s against the most powerful nation. I mean, the most powerful military on earth, and they ultimately defeated them in a guerrilla resistance.
Yeah, but I hate to be rude to revolutionaries in America, but the Viet Cong were competent. Fought wars before.
Well, we have to build the
I'm being serious, right?
I would also-
They were an organized military fighting force.
Yeah,
Comparing
I would
them to
also
revolutionaries with little pop
so part
guns
of-
is not.
part of what
like-
I like. Yeah.
I do think that armed insurrection in America probably
There's a lot of
will
experience
play
fighting
a
French
role.
people.
But I think much more likely the reason why it's important to arm in America if you're on the left is because you're going to face fascists in the next 5-6 years who are armed and are going to come to your towns and want to fight you. And the state aren't going to defend you.
No, they're not.
They're going to withdraw their monopoly on violence
Exactly.
in that conflict. So
Let me throw out to the group, because I think we're raising an interesting question, and this is the kind of discourse I encounter a lot, and that sometimes I'm a little bit contrarian to, which is in 2022, I find the state to be somewhat irrelevant. And that the model of the past, that it's sort of the people versus the state. At this point, the government is a little storefront for aggregated capital. And again, Chris knows this. Whenever people start to talk about political parties and political power, I just list BlackRock, Vanguard, Goldman Sachs. And I start to go through that list, and I start to go through the litany of the mechanisms by which capital power is exercised, right? And if you think about sort of, if you go through history and you think about, I don't want to get too explicit here, but people sort of going down to lower Manhattan with the objective to change things. They didn't go after the government. They went after the means of aggregated capital power. And so to me, and I'd be interested in everybody else's input on this, but if I'm going to make a substantive contribution to a discussion about theory today, my position is going to be forget about the state.
Well, I think there is a good point.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's a good point there. I do think the state is important in one way, and that's related to the monopoly on violence. The police are the expression of state power. Now, they do not work for the state, but they are the expression of state power on behalf of the corporations.
Yeah, good. As long as that you express it very well. Go ahead.
The police are the immediate enemy of any revolutionary movement anyone tries to form in the United States. That's just a fact.
I'll put it this way. The paper tiger is the state, and the lion is the corporation. So the lion is very, very powerful. You have the figurehead, which is the paper tiger. Then you have the powerful lion backing it, which is the military and the corporations. And that's why you have to have a counterforce in a revolutionary scenario to take on the paper tiger, and then most importantly, take on the lion.
So one other small bit of clarification, and again, don't mean to monopolize it. I just want to point out. So when I hear corporation, I am want to dig into that a little bit because, again, I distinguish personally in my own sense of how power is structured. And again, especially given where we are in 2022, the corporation, which is, big pharma, it's oil company, it's big
financial institutions.
I focus primarily, especially given the way we have aggregated financialization today, given the way like Blackstone is buying property, right, and is creating a financial instrument based on rental income. I distinguish non-trivial between corporation and aggregated capital power, which to me, again, is BlackRock, Blackstone, Vanguard, Capital Management Group.
This is a good time to point out that the enemy in any revolutionary struggle against capitalism is capital and not necessarily the corporate entities through which capital is laundered.
I think there's a mild trick being missed here, and that's that while corporations, big money, if you like, are tremendously influential, they're not actually in charge. I think that generally the anti-capitalist movement misses a trick. Not everyone, obviously, but like I think a lot of the movement misses a trick, and that is that there is no one in charge. There is no head of the Hydra that you can cut off.
That's
right. That's why we can't influence it as individuals. There's no point for you to put the lever in. Capitalism is to me best described as an artificial intelligence, right? Which is run by a whole bunch of different artificial intelligences, corporations. I think of corporations and organizations generally as kind of volition engines. I've written about this a little bit, but so you put volition in and you get effort out. But the effort is not guided by your volition. You surrender your volition to capitalist corporations, right? And to capitalism generally. And that's why we have billionaires, because billionaires are people who are the most conformist. So if you had like a pyramid of conformity, billionaires, when they're in the earning their wealth phase, are at the top of it. As they earn wealth, they conform less and less and less, and they slip more and more into obscurity, and then they get replaced by other billionaires who conform better and rise to the top. And that's because capitalism, not as a thinking agency possessing creature, but as an automated system, pushes those people to the top because they protect the system. So if you want to destroy capitalism, ultimately you have to destroy it at every point simultaneously, which is why a revolution isn't happening. What we need to do is we need to change everything at the same time. And obviously that's a monumental task. How do we even go about that? I mean, there are answers to that question, but from the outside, it seems very difficult.
So let me, I like the point that you're making. I would just tune it a little bit because I think, again, also that billionaires are irrelevant too.
I agree.
Right. Because you're talking about capitalism. So while it's a sort of many-headed hydra, the consolidation in capital markets at this point is pretty serious, so that while there's not there is a guy named Larry Fink who is in charge of BlackRock, right? So let's leave him out of the equation because you're right. He's sort of a functionary. He's a cog in the wheel, easily replaced. But there's really only 7 or 8 aggregated capital managers at this point. Again, this is just because it's 2022. It's not 1867. It's not 1973, and it's not 2007. And so while there are many points, many heads to the beast, it seems to me that pressure points, that there are in fact a handful of pressure points. And again, it's not like Lenin had to overwhelm the entire Tsarist enemy all at once. It's not as though the American Revolutionary Army, it's not as though Fidel had to compete in a sort of, massive land war, right? That there are specific strategic points. And so that's, I like what you're saying, and I think it's very apt. I would just ask you what you might think of me sort of raising this point of, well, yes, you can't cut off the heads of all the Hydra all at once, but there are some pretty strong pressure points. And if, we saw how capitalism repeatedly destroys itself, right? And in 2007, it committed suicide. It was without any external help whatsoever, and it was only salvaged because of the machination of Skyther.
Capitalism is a roller coaster; it's always up and down.
I would dispute that. I don't think it attacked itself. I think it rebirthed itself because of coming pressures. So with the climate disaster and various other pressures, there is a really ripe moment for revolution in the next 15 years, right? We're probably going to see a collapse by 2030. And so that means there's an opportunity to overthrow the system. And what we're seeing is the system reorienting itself in preparation for that combat. That's why BlackRock are buying up all the property. Yep. That's why you're seeing all this sort of stuff. This is preparation for a war that they know is coming.
My point was though that in 2007, there was a very specific set of mathematics that occurred, that the system froze. Credit froze, transaction froze, and that was not capitalists intentionally doing anything.
I think it was disaster capitalism at work. Well, I think it was people exploiting.
Talk about.
I think these guys are kind of dumb, but that's okay.
Let me talk about history for a moment. Yeah. One thing that the right and the left, sorry to say the left, but traditionally speaking, one thing that both the right and the left have traditionally been interested in is history. Marx's whole theory of economic and social evolution was based on his study of history and statistics he extrapolated from it. His whole social science model, which, I mean, people complain about Marxism all they want, but we use a fundamentally Marxian social science model in the United States. Marx invented modern social science. People don't give him enough credit for that, and it should be mentioned here.
He was a great analyzer of capitalism, but did he not also offer a system, a socialist-based economy, a communist society?
No, he did not. This is where
there were socialists before him, but they used other methods like
okay, so here is where it gets important to understand Marx. Marx offered a system of analysis and thinking which other people were supposed to use to create means and strategies and systems of economics and governance. Marx simply set up I'm going to use this word that's been misappropriated by liberals in many ways, but Marx established a critical theory for explaining why capitalism was bad and why something else would be good, that made sense to academic professorial types who didn't ride at the heads of armies or conspire with other governments to overthrow their rulers in coups. He had this which is hilarious because in theory, he's writing about a working class uprising, but he creates this intellectual system of analyzing the world that's best suited to rigorous scientific thinkers, which most working people don't have time for. I'm not saying that we can't learn theory. I feel like I've learned quite a lot of theory in my lifetime.
Well, that's why you need a vanguard.
Well, so there are different arguments that we can make about that one way or the other. I'm not hostile to the idea of a vanguard, but I also believe that the Zapatistas, and for now at least still, the Kurds in Rojava have proven that you don't need a vanguard to necessarily have a successful revolution.
But the Zapatistas don't work with the other leftists. They're very isolated.
They're very isolated. They're so anarchist they won't even call themselves anarchists because that would be avowing a system.
So they control some mountains in Chiapas. They haven't really done anything.
It's not.
I admire them, by the way. I admire the Zapatistas in their resilience, but they haven't done anything politically.
See,
they've advocated for some Mayan descendants in the mountains. And that's about it.
Oh, if you're one of those Mayan descendants, it's a huge deal.
Oh, it is, and I admire those people.
They have begun to remodel society.
They've been attacking AMLO, who's probably the best president that Mexico's had since
but that's
Cardenas in 1940.
Because,
because
so
he doesn't.
Let's be frank.
Yeah.
In terms of, is he really great by a liberal democratic standard? Sure. There are lots of good things you can say about AMLO and why he is
diplomacy,
the best thing to happen to Mexico incredible. In a long time.
He's done a lot of good for Latin America so far.
But at this point in time, he is still a liberal Democrat who is not going to be taking revolutionary power in much the same way that Hugo Chavez, though he did stay in office, he did agree to run for re-election again. He didn't disappear. Refused to take revolutionary power in Venezuela. He kept the liberal democratic state in place. It is always the liberal democratic state that smashes social democracy.
Well, I think what Hugo Chavez did was bring social democracy
to
Venezuela and help bring a social system, which was not entirely socialist, but which was far better than it was before he was in power.
I don't want to take away the real accomplishments and the real improvements in people's material conditions. What I am saying is that the Zapatistas are creating a new kind of society in Mexico. And they have a kind of society that they have managed to build and sustain. And they have done this despite the Mexican state being against them.
I would be interested in hearing John reply based on what he was talking about before with sort of the many-headed hydra and the point I made about me believing that there's certain pressure points about this idea that that there's you were talking about sort of climate collapse, laying a stage or preparing for some large-scale movement happening, and now Chris is talking about something kind of sort of a little bit more regional or specific. So I was kind of interested, John, in you sort of continuing. I meant to, not to interrupt your train of thought. You continuing to talk about how you see, from a revolutionary theory perspective, of how you see climate collapse and movements, or a movement, or regional movements, or somebody taking advantage of that. Does that make sense to the question? Is that where you were going?
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, I started a new political party called Harmony, and the sort of the idea of Harmony is to take advantage of the unrest of everything at the moment, which is partly, I believe, deliberate by, whether you want to call it capitalism or you want to call it the powers that be, whichever it is. I believe there's a deliberate upheaval at the moment, a deliberate attempt to pivot everything to something else. And I have no confidence it's going to be better, right? It's definitely going to be worse. But like the way that Harmony is intended to leverage that is by kind of judo against the state. So we've got, it's hard to describe it really, but we have a many-faceted approach which encompasses a lot of different thinking in different socialist and communist and anarchist tendencies. So we have a little bit of worker council communism in there. We have a little bit of anarchist thinking in terms of rejecting hierarchy entirely in terms of how the organization runs. So we have no leaders. We have no central organizing committee. I'm not in charge. I'm just an ordinary member. Actually, we're having a general secretary election soon, and we're going to have 2 general secretaries moving.
You have a cat behind you, so I know you're not in charge of anything, because
Oscar rules
your
everything.
Overlord, your feline overlord.
It didn't work at Occupy. The idea of harmony with everybody was capitalist, no leaders. We tried that at Occupy, and we had the slogan: everybody's a leader and nobody's a leader. And it caused a lot of confusion, and all it did, and was important what we did, symbolically and helping to change the narrative in the next generation. But if we really wanted to make an impact, we would have offered an alternative system and try to take part in the political system, not just in protests.
Harmony's not just leaderless. It's not just a rudderless thing that's like flopping around, unsure of where it's going. We've tempered that with process. So, we've anarchisted it, if you don't mind. But so essentially we have a federated structure. So there's a whole bunch of different assemblies that are run on direct democratic principles with no leaders, but with central organizers in each assembly who are elected by that assembly. And each assembly, whether the geographic assemblies or our operational assemblies or our advocacy assemblies, our ally assemblies, we have quite a lot of different types. They all focus on a specific remit. So, for example, the Disability Activism Society focuses on issues that affect disabled people and develops consensus for that topic. So nobody else in the party has a say on disability issues. Only disabled people speak on disabled issues. Only young people speak on issues that impact young people. If we have an issue that intersects, then we bring the assemblies together. If we have an issue that impacts only one group, then that assembly speaks to it. And we have ally assemblies of people who are like, oh, I want to support this group. I want to help this group. I want to support this community. But they don't lead. The allies only follow. And I think why this is particularly important is because it means that the marginalized people are pushed to the fore in the organization. So the wealthy people, you can have loads of wealthy people join if you want, but they'll never be the forefront because they can't be, because everybody is sort of equal. Like I could bribe 100 people if I had the money to say what I wanted them to say, right? But that still wouldn't be real power in this organizational system, because other people could then push it to a vote, for example, because we go by consensus first, but we have a voting system for backup when it's deadlocked. We've never used that though, but I'm sure we will eventually.
See, the problem here in the United States is that we don't know how to unite with the left elements of the working class. If we try to start something like Harmony Here, where we say rich people welcome, they'll be harmonious with us, they'll have an equal voice. Really, I don't see the point, because we're having problems just uniting the more radical elements of the working class to try to take political power.
No, that's not my point. My point is that the setup means that people are when people have their voice valued, right, in an organization, it changes how they're connected to that organization. So one of the first things that we encountered when we started the party was the enthusiasm of people who came in, were very, very shy, were scared of speaking out because they were like, oh, it's not my space. And then they found out it was their space, even though they'd only been there for 5 minutes. And that was liberating. And that gave people agency inside the party. It gave them, what's the word? It gave them more zip and zim, vim and zip.
We call it engagement in the corporate world.
Yeah, exactly. So if you imagine that on a larger scale, which we're trying to make happen now, because initially we were committed to remaining small for our first year or two because of strategy. So the goal was to remain small, nail down our processes, figure out how the system actually works, and then expand it. And we have the framework in place now. We're working on expanding it now. For example, we've just set up mutual aid, our first mutual aid project, which just gives out small payments to people who need a little bit of money for groceries or for heating or whatever, which is a very basic first step. But that in itself also drives engagement. And the idea is that the different types of activism that are on the table that can be done under the same umbrella by people with different tendencies. For example, you might have Marxist-Leninists who want to educate people, who want to focus on getting Marxism out to people. But then you might have anarchists who aren't interested in politics and perhaps aren't so much interested in educating on theory and are more interested on material stuff. But then you also have Marxist-Leninists who are interested in material stuff. And normally getting those two to actually organize together is very difficult, right?
So John,
but in this structure, they can.
So one thing I think you're talking about, which is exceptionally beautiful and wonderful and really warrants some intentional focus, is there is a tendency to see political action in terms of theory and in terms of action, right? Behaviors. And I think what's missing in that, and Chris, I almost thought this was where you were going to go when Alex was talking about people want to know what the solution is, and you were taking issue with that. I would take issue with it to some extent as well. But one thing that John is bringing up that I think is interesting is actually what people are most interested in at a fundamental level is relationships. And sometimes I think we ignore, in the process of theorizing about what would be the structures of, communal economics that would replace capitalism on one side, and the other side is where are we going to plant the bombs right on the other side in terms of action, and who are we going to recruit or whatever. And this is why, Alex, I resist a little bit this term masses. I don't believe there's any such thing as masses. I believe that we are all individuals, and that what we are all defined by ultimately is not our politics, is not our height or our weight. It is ultimately I am who I am because of who and what I'm in relationship to. This is the metaphysical underpinning. And by the way, I got a book that you got to read that goes about this. It's called The Software Revelation. I'm going to plug it. I don't care what you say. It's called The Software Revelation. It's by a guy named Xavier Kahn that gets to this root issue that in our metaphysics, we tend to think about individual entities taking action. And even when we think collectively, we think about just a large number of entities taking action. And what we still have trouble getting through our heads is that no man is an island. No person is an island. I'm quoting John Donne, but he used gender specific. But that what Marx talked about was not just the economic theory. You said it very well, because he also had a social theory, and central to his social theory was alienation from labor.
Yes,
is alienation, and Freud talked about this whole idea of the social science of alienation, and people are freaking alienated. And yes, not being able to pay rent and having a job that doesn't pay him enough and not having health care are all sort of manifestations of that alienation. But me not having health care alienates me from my society. And when you give me money for mutual aid, or you show up on my webcast, or you buy my book, or you like me, give me a like on Twitter, whatever it is, you make an assertion that you are in a relationship with me. And if you're in a relationship with me, I will forgive you a lot of theoretical failures. I will forgive you a lot of failures to do action, because amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. And so sometimes I think in our discussions, like one of the great things that's going on right now, I don't know if anybody else is joining us, but the four of us are creating a relationship. And that relationship is inherently transformative. So, Alex, when you talk about Occupy, I agree that there were some failures there. I mean, I was at Occupy here in New York City. I agree there was failures. I agree there was stuff that was effed up about it. What I might disagree with is that, yes, there was a change of narrative, but it also formed relationship. And those relationships are powerful. I have a relationship. I'll just, kind of throw out there. There's a guy, I won't name him, but a lot of you may know him because he has a Twitter presence, and he goes out on the street and he does things for other people. And I don't think he's right about a lot of theory. And I don't know if I would like him personally, but I support him with my heart and soul because he is actually doing something where he touches other human beings in relationships, right? And now I'm in a relationship with him, even though we probably don't have that much in common, but we are in a revolutionary relationship with each other. You understand what I'm saying? So I think what you're talking about, John, about this process, if we have process that builds relationship, who knows where it goes? I don't need.
I mean, that's the goal.
But Chris, do you agree with them that you have to have love and harmony with the capitalists in order to be successful? You have to work with them.
I didn't say that.
I didn't say anything.
That's what I'm understanding. I'm misunderstanding, I guess.
No.
Remember,
we're no harmony with
capitalism.
No.
What we're talking about.
Well, somebody said harmony with the rich. The rich can join, but I guess not all the rich are capitalists.
I said the rich could join, but they would have their influence. They would find that their influence was diluted.
Yeah, because they have the same voice as everybody else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I want to add voice to the working class.
And by the way,
but this is how you do it, right?
Dude, man, let me just say, rich doesn't mean anything. The amount of money you can have money and be a pro if you make your money without exploiting.
I'll give you a classic example of how being rich does not mean you are not exploited labor. Professional fucking sports.
I'm going to disagree, because I think being rich does mean that effectively you are exploitative. So like if I was a millionaire,
I'm not saying
the reason I was a millionaire, and that is because I keep my money.
I'm not saying that people who are exploited are not also exploitative.
Yeah, and rich is a term. I mean, you can have a personal labor-based income in the States of $140,000 a year, and if you don't own stock, and if you're not a landlord, and if you don't run a business where you pay employees wage slavery, you can. I think that's all I was hearing John say. If somebody wants to join and be an ally, and they don't own stock, and they're not a landlord, they're not all that. It's not the amount of money you have. It's what your economic relationship is to the proletariat,
and also to property and capital.
Yeah,
the point was more that in liberal democratic parties and organizations, if a rich person joins, then they bring donations with them.
Yes,
they bring connections and other donations with them. In our party, we're a party of small donations, where your voice is what matters, not your vote. So like they can't buy a block of votes.
Best example
is just by being wealthy. Which
I don't want to get off the point, John, that I wanted to ask you about, which is this idea of that part of the movement above and beyond theory and action is what you seem to be talking about, which is to establish a process, even within an anarchistic framework, by which people can get into relationships with each other and create comradeship.
Yes.
Gender.
Yeah. And people have a relationship with the movement.
Yes.
I mean, one of the first things that we did was set up something called the REC. The REC is our community center online, essentially. And like people engage with that first. They come and they play games with us. They, post pictures of the animals. They do that sort of thing first. They use our mental health support group, for example. And that's how you build a relationship with people. I mean, what started the whole thing off was my local university, a friend of mine who's not a lecturer, who's a staff there. Sorry, I don't know why I said lecturer. The staff at the university, and there's going to be a strike. And they say to me, I'm going to have to miss a meal every 2 days because of this strike. But it means so much to me that I'm going on strike anyway. And I just went, well, no, you're not going to miss a meal. Pfft, forget that. I'm going to go and get some soup. I'm going to get a cooker. I'm going to come down to the strike line and I'm going to cook people breakfast every morning that the strike is there. And I then realized I didn't have a cooker and I couldn't afford any soup. So I blagged the cooker, I blagged some soup, and I hauled my ass up there every morning for 3 weeks. And what people repeatedly said to me was, when can I vote for you?
Yeah.
They said it over and over and over again. And they said it because I fed them, right? That's why they said it. They said it because they were like, wow, you're this organization who's just turned up and fed us. You're not connected to the university, because I wasn't not a student even.
Let's face that the enemy knows this. Jim Clyburn has this big fish fry in South Carolina where he feeds Democrats. He literally invites bigwig Democrats and gives them food so that they love him.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of other bushwhackery and skullduggery that goes around Clyburn's fish fry.
That's what charity is, right? The charity sector is fundamentally a way to prop up conservative groups in America and Britain. And the church charity sector, in particular in Britain, is enormously powerful in supporting the Tories in government.
I gotta go soon because I'm not feeling too well, but I wanted to make a couple points before I went. First off, I used to go to the Left Forum in New York, and I used to go with Bruce Wright. And a lot of times leftists, they forget to thank the workers that are catering these events and the janitors. And that's what we're supposed to be fighting for as leftists and socialists. So I remember Bruce Wright and I would go up to them, to the workers, and thank them for what they were doing. And that's something that I did today, because today I wasn't feeling well and I went to the ER. I'm okay now. But while I was in the ER, there was a janitor that was working near where I was stationed, and I saluted them. I was very nice to them and appreciative of them, and they were wondering why. So I'm sure some of you have seen the English Patient with Ralph Fiennes. If I wrote an article about today, I'd call it the Socialist Patient. because our interactions with workers, whether we're in a forum or in that type of setting, should always show appreciation for those that we're fighting for and not forget what the fight's about. And that's why I think it's always important to emphasize and give a voice to the working class and to the downtrodden in general.
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah.
And
I couldn't agree more with that.
So what's wrong? You going to tell us what's bothering you? Your tummy is.
I'm very tired. I've had a long day, but I got prescribed what I needed to get prescribed, and it's good to be here. I still wanted to be here for the beginning of the show. So
appreciate it, man.
I'm hoping that the fact that you made it is good news.
I'm a cat. I don't know how many lives I got left, but I'm a cat. I've been in tough situations. I don't know if I told you a story, Chris, about the first year of New Year's of 2012 at Occupy New York. But literally, I fell asleep the first hour of 2012 on top of Mount Liberty. We successfully took the barricades from the police, built a mountain with it, and I was just exhausted after the struggle of the tug of war with the police, where we defeated them. Because most of them were down in Times Square. It was New Year's, and so we outnumbered them. We defeated the police. They couldn't touch us. They couldn't arrest us. And we took all their barricades and built a mountain. We call it Mount Liberty. And when I fell asleep on Mount Liberty for the first hour of 2012, a bunch of comrades made the stupid decision to go, because, again, no leadership. They went and they left us where we didn't have reinforcements, and then the police were coming from Times Square and encroaching on us. And so I woke up and there was blood and beatings all around me and just madness. And my instinct said, walk, don't run. And so I was invisible. I was just walking with all this chaos around me, and none of the cops would touch me. It was like I wasn't there. And then I went down to the below Mount Liberty and witnessed more of the repression around me. And all of a sudden I saw a small group of comrades that were running through the subway. And they said, we're going to go take over the police precinct. We're going to free our comrades. So I went with them. Then the helicopters came, the cops on the scooters. This is when they got really pissed, because they call it the kenneling, right? You've heard of the term, the kenneling. And so I remember they stopped us and they made us go one by one, and then we just regrouped again. And now they were really mad, because we were heading down on the precinct, the ones that weren't arrested at Zuccotti Park. And so there was about 50 of us left at that point. And they did the kenneling again. Like, I was literally getting a drink for a comrade, and I saw the cops coming on the scooters, and I ran through the cops to get over and give the comrade the drink. And then that's when they said, disperse. And my instincts came again, and they said, get in the corner and don't move. Don't listen to the police. And so every person that dispersed, their head was thrown down in the cement. Bah, 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 blood spewing everywhere. And there was a woman with me from Miami, and she said, I can't get caught with this backpack. I said, don't worry. And so we stayed in the corner, and everybody around us. And I remember there was a female cop, because we're talking about the Gestapo here, the New York, the NYPD, the worst of the worst, Bloomberg's cops, who he bragged was his private army. And so I remember they had a female cop, a white cop, pointed to one of the African-American protesters and said, cigarette, get him too. Bah! And so there was maybe 10 of us left. And then they said, raise your hand if you want to go. And then they continued, bah! And out of 50 people, 3 got out. Me, the young woman from Miami, and some other guy. And they never caught her with the bag. And then the funny part of the story, this is in my book about Occupy, is that one of those hot dog stands was opening up first thing in the morning, in the first day of 2012, and I was so thirsty and fatigued, so I just grabbed the iced tea and I chugged it. She said, "You get arrested for that," and I said, "After everything happened tonight." And so we ended up in literally in a cellar, like in Brooklyn at one of the safe houses. But yeah, that was quite a night. So I do have a sentimental appreciation for Occupy, but in all fairness, though, we only really changed the narrative. So that's on the next generation who are more aware now because of the new narrative to try to make a revolutionary scenario. So let's hope that'll come about.
Yeah, but you're also still talking about it, so that says more.
I am, but a lot of people aren't. Like my niece is 14. How much does she know about it? I don't think she's read her uncle's book yet about it, but the next generation, they really have to get more informed about it.
There was a quick point I wanted to make about something you said, which was that Occupy didn't have leadership. And
well, we said we were all leaders at the same time, but
no, I understand. I understand that, but one of the problems with a completely leaderless model is that you need something which I don't know if anyone else calls it that, but I call it emergent leadership. And
I'll look that up.
You need to develop enough group consciousness as a collective that especially in crisis situations, people listen to the voice that actually has reason, if that makes sense. So if you're trying to make a cup of tea, then you should have somebody who's good at making a cup of tea be in charge that day, right? If you're cleaning up leaves in the garden, then somebody who knows how to use a rake should be in charge. And I think one of the things that's often misunderstood about anarchism is that in anarchism there are leaders. It's just that we don't have pieces of paper to tell us.
Chomsky calls it organized anarchism. I've interviewed Chomsky before. I remember when I was in Standing Rock, I entered the tea tent to get some tea. And, you know, in Standing Rock at that time in North Dakota, there was people from all over the world going there. And so I made a probably very bad British accent, right? But for you, but I walked in and I'm like, this tea is not proper enough. I want a different tea. And they said, okay, we're going to get you something else. Like, you know, I'm not British, right? But, you know, I went in there and like, they actually thought I was from Europe. You know?
That wasn't the worst British accent I've ever heard. So.
It depends what part you're from, right? Because it could be tea instead of tea.
I mean, it was probably better than if I tried to do your accent. So.
Oh yeah, I don't want to hear his American. Well, nice seeing you guys. Have a great night.
Have a
You
great
too.
night.
I hope you feel better tomorrow.
Thank you.
No, I think that emergent leadership is a good point. I think if you have an organization where people listen to the person who sounds like they know what they're doing, but sometimes that's what it comes down to. But the people that they trust to know what they're doing in specific scenarios.
I think that's part of the relational. I think but relationality kind of enables that organically, right?
Yes.
You can't do that unless you know what people's giftings are, and you also have a sense of who's a blowhard, who's going to chase it just because they're a blowhard.
That really.
Who's laying back and who you want to encourage to have come forward.
I think what you're saying is sort of a slightly different variant of what I was just thinking, which is that what you really need is information quality. So in Harmony, our facilitators, our organizers, which are called secretaries. The secretaries, part of the role of a secretary is to facilitate knowledge. So you have to, because I was the first general secretary of the party. When there isn't a secretary for an assembly, the general secretary has to do the role. So I did a lot of facilitating early on. And essentially that just means turning up with information. It means saying, this is this is that, this is something else. Here's this research I did. Here's the source for that. Here's the source for that. And then people can either do the research themselves from what you bring them, or they can take it on trust. And especially when you have more people organizing and people saying, well, no, that's not quite right. I've got this source. I've got that source. And you can, as you raise your information quality, you'll find that leadership emerges more clearly. Mm-hmm. So as everyone becomes more informed, people will start to take themselves out. They'll say, oh, I don't know this topic at all. They'll shut up. You'll also have, of course, blowhards who will never, ever, ever, ever shut up, no matter how little they know about the topic. I'm sometimes like this, right? I'm just like, I'll learn it on the spot. Why not? But,
it's interesting because churches know a lot about this stuff too. It's interesting. There's a lot. I mean, the movement isn't so strong now, but I'm talking as somebody who formerly, because you mentioned about your dad sort of working as an evangelist, and it kind of struck me that this came up. But kind of what they called the emergent church did a lot of research into this too, because one of the questions was, what is the hierarchy like in the local church, right? And why are these pastor-centric organizations, and why are people getting turned off to it? And we've seen it in business. We've seen it in a few places where there's this idea of absolutely collecting information, doing things with intentionality to develop those who are not currently exercising what they call their gifts, and to find out what those gifts are, because not everybody puts their gifts forward right away. But man, oh man, people are just dying to be utilized in a cause for other people who they feel valued by. I mean, a lot of the revolutionary theory kind of fades in the background once you have a group of people. The military knows how to do this too. That's how they build, they build units of people who are willing to die for each other.
Let's look at a successful a successful revolution, or at least partially successful revolution in those terms. The Bolsheviks were a bunch of relationships. You have relationships between Lenin and Trotsky and Zinoviev, and Lenin and Stalin, and Trotsky and Stalin in his circle, and all these various relationships that are always shifting and changing. And the relationships very much drove the direction of the nascent Soviet state. When Lenin was mostly listening to Trotsky, you see this very clear vision of what we're trying to accomplish, while at the same time being willing to perhaps be a little dirty about getting there. And then when you start seeing some of these changes in relationships and these changes, you see that expressed in policy as people become more interested in compromising with capitalism in order to increase agricultural output. When Lenin was listening to Bukharin, sudden forced collectivization when Stalin stopped listening to anyone.
I think at a more grassroots level, although I think Alex brought up something important, and it sounded, I wanted to caution about that this shouldn't be performative, but the reality of revolution to me in daily life is a complete dedication on a daily basis to the outcast, right?
Yes.
So for example, in the States, every time you go to the supermarket, there's somebody out there pushing the carts around.
Yes.
And those people are non-persons under capitalism.
Yes.
And it doesn't take
I've done that job.
Right? Yeah. So you, as an ex-non-person, you're still a non-person. So who cares? Right? We're all non.
I mean, I am. Yeah, I'm disabled, so I'm one of the most non-people.
Yeah. So we're all trying to. I mean, that's what sin is, to become a non-person. But you know, revolutionary daily praxis, before you worry again about what you blow up or what your economic model of collaborative co-op owned businesses is going to be, the first thing to do is to interact with the person who's pushing the cart.
I will say that when deciding what to blow up, pay close attention to the African National Congress in South Africa.
Go ahead, brother.
That aside, no, Lenny's right. I mean, the most important thing we can do is help each other.
The most revolutionary act is mutual aid.
The leaders of the Black Panthers were not murdered because they were on the brink of overthrowing the federal state. The leaders of the Black Panther were murdered because they were proving that people in cities didn't need their city governments.
They were building relationships through breakfast programs. And
yes.
And by the way, it's not just revolutionary action is not just mutual aid. It's specifically mutual aid where you are attracted to the lumpen. You are attracted to the proletariat. You're attracted to the cultural outcast, right? So this is where intersectionality comes in, whether it has to do with gender identity or whether it has to do with somebody getting out of jail.
This is a good note. This is a good note to mention that Huey Newton was woke.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a piece in the 70s about why the Black Panthers were in solidarity with gay rights and women's rights.
Mm-hmm.
And he said outright, this is why we get mad at women and this is why we abuse gay people, and we need to cut that shit out because, they're oppressed.
And they made Kathleen Cleaver the Minister of Information. So,
Yeah.
I think it's also worth remembering that marginalized groups have been resisting since they were born.
Yes.
Yeah? So especially the most marginalized groups, like I'm not talking necessarily about most in terms of like they had the most damage done to them. By most marginalized, I mean the people you think of least when I say marginalized.
Yeah.
So in the UK, that's, for example, Roma and travelers. Because but they have a history of resistance, that we should be learning from, and often we're not. We're ignoring them, and we're saying that they're not educated enough to take part. They're lumpen proletariat or whatever, and that attitude is wrong. They know more about resistance than we do. They've been doing it for like in the case of the Roma community in Britain, they've been resisting genocide for 150, 200 years now.
This is my favorite bit of Bolshevik trivia when it comes to reaching out to the lumpen. Lenin kept Stalin around because Stalin was the guy who talked to the gangsters and thugs and bank robbers for it, which is hilarious because Stalin studied to be a priest.
Well, I was going to bring up the Jesuit influence on Stalin before, but I'm going to go back. But I think, by the way, this is just so important that and that our conversation has taken this direction. That again, with everything else we can discuss about political theory and organization, that underlying at the base of it, to me, is a metaphysic that's relational and does not discount any human life, and it does the opposite. That responds like a Venus flytrap, right? A insect lands on it, and the leaf kind of curls around it. We have to check ourselves spiritually to say, are my antenna really out for when it is that I, with whatever is left in me of bourgeois consciousness or class consciousness or whatever else it is, that I am withdrawing from somebody who's chronically ill, somebody who's again, somebody who's just out of prison, somebody who's from some nationality, whatever it is. One experience I had where I realized this is when I was in a community once where there was a large immigrant community, and it was specifically a Mexican immigrant community, and there was such a dividing line. And one of the things I actually saw physically, one of the things that you notice is that there are people who will not meet your eyes when you're interacting with them because they've been so conditioned that they are not going to meet you like this because they're constantly meeting people like this. And it's easy to fall into the trap, again, depending what your social giftings are, to say, okay, well, they're not meeting my eyes, they're not friendly, I'm not going to be friendly to them. Instead of taking the act of and saying, as a revolutionary, it is my responsibility to meet somebody where they are. And if I notice somebody is lowering their eyes before me, that tells me that's exactly who I need to gravitate towards, right? Because that's a person who has already internalized the alienation of the capitalist society in which we live because of the material conditions of either, again, being incarcerated, of being racially or ethnically different, whatever it is. And boy, that, again, whatever destination we may have, that practice, and that's why I was interested in, John, you talking about how you manage that practice and how you establish that process is so powerful, because I don't believe, when I see people talking about uniting the working class, and again, Chris, you've heard me rant about this before, I don't want to unite the working class. The objective of revolution is not to create a condition that we think has to exist before revolution and then say, well, once we unite the working class, we will take this action. On the contrary, you don't need the working class to be united. You just need a sufficient cadre of people. You need a sufficient number of people who are in relationship with each other, have the right giftings, and are willing to put their lives on the line for each other and put aside their own material well-being or whatever for a cause. And then you can aim that at whatever it needs to be aimed at.
And who are also willing to live that revolutionary lifestyle that you're talking about, where you're looking for the people who need that true welcome from.
Yeah, sorry, when you said revolutionary lifestyle, I just thought you meant poor, but that's just
well, that's a whole different issue. I will admit that I make, as sad and depressing as it may sound, I make far more money from my day job than I do from this.
Sure.
So I certainly understand poverty.
Marx needed Engels. Look, Marx needed Engels. So,
yes.
Right? So let's make that clear. But that's why when you talk about rich, I mean, rich is a weird word. It's like left. It doesn't really mean anything.
I mean, to me, rich has a specific meaning. It's almost everyone else in Western society.
Yeah.
So as a disabled person, I can't work in a stable fashion. So like I can do labor, but I can't work 5 days a week. I just can't. I burn out after 2 or 3. I have to take breaks in particular ways. I have to do all sorts of coping mechanisms to do the harmony work I do.
Yeah.
And honestly, it burns me out more than I like. It's probably going to have health ramifications and so on and so forth. But like I couldn't hold down an everyday job. I've tried before. I've worked in a whole wide variety of things, everything from factory work to cleaning aircraft with a broom on a stick. So like, I forgot my point now.
About who's rich.
Yeah. So to me, and a lot of other people, everyone else is rich. Everyone with a job to me is rich.
Yeah.
Like the concept, for example, of going on holiday. If you've been on holiday, to me, I'm a little bit thinking you're rich.
Right.
If you've got warm weather clothes for next winter,
yeah,
you're definitely richer than me. I have warm weather clothes from 3 winters ago. So it's like,
with that definition,
yeah,
to me, if that's the definition of rich, people who are like that, they could do a lot of mutual aid. I mean, I've motivated a lot of people like that to do things in the interest of the underclass.
People don't understand how far small amounts of money can go.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the one of the things we did in Harmony before we did any mutual aid outside the party was we started passing money around inside the party, right? We started supporting each other. We did that whole thing of passing the same £20 note around for 3 months. Right. I remember that this literally happened. I lent 20 quid to somebody, and then, oh shit, I need 20 quid. So I borrowed 20 quid from somebody. And then about a week later, somebody else needed 15 quid from me. So I gave them 15 quid. And then I was 15 quid short. So someone gave me 15 quid. And this went on for about a month, right? So like, I think people don't understand how much small amounts of money can really go far. Like, I think I just have a quick look. Our emergency payment fund, which is only about 2 weeks old now, just look on the spreadsheet because it's on the website. There we go. Has made 25 payments. That's £488 worth of payments so far in the first 2 weeks, which is not bad. That's, by the way, that's equivalent to nearly a quarter of the money that the party has taken in its first 2 years. We did put in, I think it was 100 quid initially to the EPF. So it's not a bad amount, right? That's a fairly good amount of money to raise in 3 weeks. Yeah. And like each 20 quid, every 20 quid that we've given out has been important to those people. Like it's not been, oh, it'd be nice to have 20 quid. I could go and get my hair cut or something. Oh, no, haircuts don't cost 20 quid. They cost more than that now. But like that 20 quid was important every single time. And a fiver is important when you have very little money. A fiver could be the difference between you getting a job and not, for example. It could be the difference between a whole career and a lifetime of poverty. And people don't understand that. And people don't get that giving up very small things to give your time and money to mutual aid can have an enormous impact. I think that's something that we really want to do with Harmony as well, is encourage people to do small things. One of the things, because I'm disabled and a lot of the early members of the party were disabled as well, one of the things we've had to get really good at is micro labor. So you split every job up into like 100 different parts and everyone does a small piece of it, bit Manhattan Project style sometimes. Right. And
wait, you're building a bomb?
Damn it, why do I admit it on the internet? No, but look, like this concept of bringing small amounts of money or labor in large volumes from large volumes of people. I mean, that's how the revolution happens, really. That's how you change. I mean, my idea of revolution is like, sorry for breaking the sentence off. My idea of revolution is not some big event. It's not like a Super Bowl where once you've got the teams have won all the games, they go to the Super Bowl and they compete and there's a halftime show. It's not like that to me. I think it is to some people. They think that that if you have the right sequence of games, you get the Super Bowl. If you win all the games, you get to go to the Super Bowl. And that's not what a revolution is for me. For me, revolution is like a billion small acts over decades, over the last 2 centuries. We're in a revolution right now, right? The revolution is ongoing, has been ever since the first person said we need one. And it consists of all of the small acts, all of the relational acts, if you like, the building of relationships between people that create communities that can then add up to a consensus, which eventually says no more.
Well,
and once enough of us say no more in terms of capitalism, it's gone. That's the thing about it, right? Because this is how the world works, and people don't understand it is. If we all just say it's gone, it is. Like, it's as simple as that. The thing only exists because we called it into being in the first place.
Yeah.
So how we get rid of it is we all say it's gone.
So I'm nodding like crazy. I know Chris is too, but I'll just say,
sorry.
I no, it's good. It's the only caveat I'll put on that is I still, in my pragmatism, believe that is true, but that is the combination of that plus a couple of big things. Maybe not Super Bowls, but maybe conference finals.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that's why when I say when you say as soon as it only exists because we think it is, and when we say it isn't, it is no more. Again, I think I tend to bring some specificity to it, which is why I call out large financial institutions, because one of the things I teach my bourgeois cohort that they don't know, so they're all talking about guns right now in the state.
Yeah.
And one of the things I do is I show them, okay, well, and you're pointing the finger at the NRA and the GOP. I say, but your 401k is invested in Smith & Wesson.
Mm-hmm.
So that's so to me, having some specificity about capitalism, not just as a set of class forces that are in the air, but being very specific. BlackRock owns 7.4% of outstanding Smith & Wesson stock. Your funds of your retirement fund from your pension are managed by BlackRock. Ergo, you own that. Ergo, you're a stock owner. You're invested in this thing that you say you're against. The way to actually materially withdraw your support is simply to withdraw your money. So it's not just saying no, sort of in some kind of sort of epistemic way. There's a set of very specific actions, whether it's right.
I should stress, I mean, saying no in a very allegorical way, right? There's action to it, there's praxis to it, as well as like verbalizing, and my cam blurring is driving me out of the wall.
Sorry, Chris, you were I jumped in on you.
Well, no, it's good conversation, and I'm trying to talk less and listen more. But I was going to say that I think there are several different ways to look at a revolution. And I do believe there are a lot of people who kind of see a general strike or a big riot or something like that as a Super Bowl that happens and you win and it's over and everything changes and is better right away.
Right.
And I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, but I study Marxist-Leninism. I talk to Marxist-Leninists. I have a very great appreciation of Trotskyist labor activists and labor reporters here in the U.S. But all that aside, I'm not a Marxist, but I do believe that Marx was giving people a way to study and learn and develop, not a specific roadmap or a set of dogma. And when you start to dogmatize instead of theorizing and testing your theories, because remember, a theory comes in two portions. First, you have a hypothesis, and your hypothesis is tested, and then you have a conclusion. And it is the process of going from hypothesis to conclusion that makes a theory. And a lot of people forget that, and they think in terms of conclusions, and that the way Lenin did things or the way Mao did things are the way things have to be done.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, it's both good and bad.
Yeah.
It's good in the sense that you have a clear roadmap of something that has succeeded before.
Mm-hmm.
But it is bad because no situation is ever exactly the same twice, even though history is very repetitious.
It's very repetitious, but we are we're clearly in something special. And the line from T.S. Eliot is thinking of a key, each confirms a prison.
Yeah.
Right? So that's my way of expressing it. And that's why sometimes when people say we have to do this, like we have to unify the working class, I'm like, okay, well, that's not the objective. And as soon as you decide, it happens over and over again, right? In everybody's career in their art, they say, well, if only this would happen, I could X.
Yeah,
right?
well, and
let's happen, I would Y. And then Y never happens because you're setting X as a precondition.
There's nothing in Leninism, Marxist Leninism, that says, now we shall unify the working class and revolt. No, Marxist Leninism says, we shall revolt and unify the working class.
Exactly.
Yeah, the act of revolution is what brings people together. I mean, it's in the word, right? It's in the words. If you think about it, like the word movement, for example, right?
And
if I say to everybody, let's go down the street, and I just stand still, the odds of people going down the street are very low. But if I gesture, come with me, we're going down the street, and I start walking, some people will walk with me.
Especially if you already have one or two people with you.
Yeah.
And you don't say, follow me, let's go down the street, and say, me and my buds.
Yeah. And anybody who wants to be with us walks with us. Right. That's how movements are. They move, right? And
by the way, people talk about Dr. King. Dr. King's classic example, right? The movement was already there. He didn't create the movement by saying, I'm going to give a speech and everybody's going to follow me. He facilitated a movement that was organically already happening.
And also the best leaders of movements facilitate the movement of the movement. So one of my favorite quotes is Rosa Luxemburg. Those who do not those who do not notice their chains. No, those who do not move do not notice their chains. Got it right way around eventually.
Yeah.
And I think that applies in a lot of different situations. Like, for example, one of the main arguments of we have to unify the working class is as an argument against criticism. So if you have a movement and someone says, look, the movement's doing it wrong, we need to fix X, Y, and Z. Someone will say, well, that's not going to unify the working class. We have to ignore X, Y, and Z so that we can get people on board. We'll fix it later. But that is an exact example of not noticing your chains, because X, Y, and Z are what are preventing your movement from moving.
Exactly. They're what is dividing the working class. For instance, this is the best example. Lenny and I have spoken on this subject a great deal. In America, black people don't trust white people. Why do black people not trust white people in America? Because they shouldn't.
Yes, 100%.
And when you look at it from that point of view, why don't black people trust white people? Because they shouldn't. Then a whole lot of things that people in the media pretend are mysterious suddenly make sense.
Yeah.
Now, you go back in history and you keep in mind that the American concept of black and white is an artificial social construct that was used because an opportunistic politician and a group of runaway slaves and their runaway white indentured servant buddies got together, had a rebellion, and nearly took over the colony. And after this happened, the powers that be thought to themselves, well, we can't have the indentured servants and the slaves getting together again. And they invented the concepts of black and white as they exist in America today in a very real way that did not exist in the same way prior. Which is not to say that there were not racial differences.
No, because I read Othello, so I know that's not true.
But those racial differences were bridged in the Virginia colony by a common experience.
Correct. And if you read Othello, the difference is not that he's less than, he's a Moor, but he also is a general who's like the baddest ass in the play.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, and I think that's part of, to me, relationality, that even though we're sort of three white guys sitting around talking, I mean, Chris and I, we've talked about this, because I think also part of revolutionary practice is intentionally centering somebody other than somebody who looks like me. I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of pretty basic to it.
I mean,
that takes some intentionality. It's so hard for white guys to do that.
It really, really is. I had to learn it. I had to consciously learn it.
I think one of the things that arises from that for me is and something I've been saying a lot recently, and that is that if you take the intersections of marginalized groups, that's where revolution arises from.
Yeah.
Resistance, sorry, I shouldn't say revolution. It's where resistance arises from, is the intersections of marginalized groups. And a lot of marginalized people who are white are very resistant to that as a concept, because it goes against what they've been taught their whole life, which is that they're more important than other marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And if their resistance is dependent on other marginalized groups, then that devalues them. And this is why we don't have unity on the left. Let's be blunt about it. It's because white people throw their toys out of the pram and say, I don't want to listen to them. I mean, it's not just socialists and communists either. It's anarchists too. This is why we have Anarchata. This is why Anarchata exists, because white anarchists, are no more trustworthy than any other group. Well, all right, I'm not going to say no more trustworthy. Are mostly no more trustworthy than other groups. I think it's a slight improvement in some senses.
This is the point where I will point out that you should never forget that in the history of the United States, anarchist includes the word CIA. Mm-hmm. Not in that order, but they are in there. And that anarchy in the United States was deliberately supported at one point by the CIA in order to undermine communist organizing. It was done in order to put criticisms of socialist Vietnam and socialist North Korea and communist China into anti-capitalist spaces, so that people who saw themselves as anti-capitalists would then exclude state socialism from their revolution in a way that only benefited the United States Cold War effort at the time. Because the only real force holding the American imperial capitalist state at bay, for good or ill, was the Soviet Union. And there are many criticisms that can be made of Putin. But when you talk about the economic damage, the political divisions, the degree to which the right has been empowered in Eastern Europe, because it turned out that all these champions of democracy that the US was supporting turned out to be Nazis. It really was the greatest humanitarian disaster in human history. It was terrible for Europe. It was terrible for Yugoslavia. You can't deny that. Whatever side or not side one takes in the awful things that happened there.
Don't, you're gonna break my heart. I was in Tito's Yugoslavia, and
yes,
it's the greatest fucking place.
Yes,
I love it. And not to break your reverie, but I think that this is part of the reason that I'm cautious about saying the revolution will occur in 2026.
Yeah.
And it'll take 4 years, and then 2030 we're going to come to power, and here's what we're going to implement, because it's just we're not living live in the real world, right?
No.
And it divides people who, they're state socialists versus that, and everybody has a theory about the future. But I probably disagree with both of you guys about what the future should be like, but I'm willing to sort it out when we get there.
Yes. And that's the important part.
That might be a difference between us, because to me, the character of the revolution will define the character of the thing that comes after. So to me, it's crucial that we get it right in the revolution itself. If we don't get it right in the revolution itself, then what we get is the Soviet Union again, because that's what happened there. They got it wrong in the revolution.
Well,
the revolution itself, I know it was successful in terms of overthrowing the state, in terms of replacing it, but it was unsuccessful in the sense that it was unsustainable. And I think that if we want a sustainable, I'm sort of an advocate for permanent revolution anyway, because I don't think we're going to end up in a civilization, or not a civilization. I don't think we're going to end in a society that works.
Right.
We're going to end in a society that wants to work, which is a lot closer to good.
Yeah.
And then we have to work on honing it, on improving it. I think that the only way to make that work is if we all agree on one central goal. And I think that central goal has to be reduction of human suffering.
Well, that's fine. And that's
rejection of utilitarianism in particular.
Yeah.
What in particular?
Utilitarianism.
So I agree there, but I don't think that agreement, that reduction of human suffering, or what I call the summum bonum, or whatever word we use to say that society has to work for everybody rather than an elite, or those who consider themselves elite, is the same as agreeing about, and the specific mechanism by which that will happen will be nationalization of this, and the only businesses that exist will all be worker cooperatives, and being very sort of, I'm not sure that we're disagreeing. I think
let's talk again about, I'm going to argue with something John said about the USSR. No offense to them. The USSR's problems did not come from the character of its revolution. The USSR's problems came from the character of its struggle with counter-revolution.
And its response, in terms of Stalin's response to counter-revolution?
Stalin's decision to embrace counter-revolution on many levels. I'm not going to say that Lenin and Trotsky were perfect. They were not. It's very important to understand that Trotsky did absolutely have the majority of Makhno's Black Army killed. That Makhno only escaped himself with his life because he had friends who helped him get away. But they were genuinely working to reduce human suffering as much as possible for everyone.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
And they were trying to reject not totalitarianism, that's not the word I'm looking for. They were trying to reject utilitarianism and instead try to embrace a standard of material conditions for everyone. Now, what this meant, and this is really important to understand, I don't think it's possible for a lot of Americans here to understand this, because we have never been in a monarchist system. There were certain things that had to happen in order for the Russian Empire to be overthrown, ultimately. There was not any way to leave a legitimate czar alive and expect a revolution against a dynasty to succeed. Now, we can say that we approve or disapprove of decisions that were made, but if the goal is to get rid of the Russian Empire and establish some new system that is based on cooperation of many nations as opposed to just Russians running everything. Because one thing that gets forgotten is that Lenin was extremely good on indigenous rights. There were specific Soviet socialist republics that were set up for and controlled by the indigenous minority and not the Russian majority, for the specific purpose of protecting their nationality. Is the word Lenin used. It's not what Americans would mean by it now, but protecting their culture and protecting their way of life and protecting their autonomy surrounded by Russians. Yeah. In order to be autonomous, they had to be in charge.
So I'm curious though, so I appreciate you laying that aspect, that narrative out. John, my sense is that you have a specific sense of what the revolution did wrong that led to a specific pathology into what was established afterwards. And maybe you can just concisely, so I know what you're talking about, name the pathology in the revolution that led to what pathology in the state.
I think the key problem for me is that the revolution became over time, in particular, we covered it earlier, it became about personality, it became about relations. And while the relations are important, I think the problem was that because those people, I mean, you can see it now, right? People look back and they lionize certain individuals. And that happened at the time too.
Yes.
And people lined up behind these individuals. And obviously as an anarchist, I think that when we have leaders who become firm leaders, who become embedded leaders by right, that's a problem. And I think that undermines the movement. I think that the revolution was undermined. The revolution was undermined.
You don't want to see this face on the flag, and you don't want to see this freaking wall. Look, before you apply it, look carefully. Look at this face. Don't you want to see?
Yeah, you can go on the coins. It's fine. But like, I think if you look at the early years of the of the revolution, because the revolution obviously wasn't just like the bit where the empire was overthrown, it was ongoing. If you look at the early years of the revolution and you look at accounts of people, particularly people not from Russia, who were attracted to Russia because they were like, oh, a communist society I can go and live in. A recurring theme is how top people in the party exploited their proximity to weighty figures for material benefits. And that undermined the whole thing from the very beginning.
And you would say the same thing about Fidel and Mao too, then?
Yeah, I would. I would say it about every revolution that has happened. The character of the revolution needs to be lacking something that has been there almost every single time. And I think the problem is that most of these revolutions are violent revolutions, right? So if you have a violent revolution, we discussed this earlier in the reading group as well. If you have a violent revolution, one of the flaws is especially if it takes a while. So if you have an immediate violent revolution, like an uprising, and the government is overthrown and it's all done, it takes 3 days, then you don't get powerful groups forming where, for example, you might have a strategic disagreement in week 7 of your revolution about you attack this target or you attack this target, or whether you reinforce here, and you get factions form around that. And then 9 weeks into your revolution, this faction gets decimated. This faction is now much smaller, and this faction is huge because they did the right thing. And suddenly that faction is in charge. And that faction isn't in charge because of consensus or because they're the most clever people or because they have the good strategy or whatever. They're in charge because of luck. And luck is not democracy. So if you want a democratic outcome, then violent revolutions are really problematic because they undermine the future in the sense that people get used to the idea that might makes right. And I don't necessarily mean might in the sense of guns and force, but like if you can sway the argument by saying, yeah, but I was having dinner with Lenin the other day.
I totally get what you're saying. And I agree, but there's a heavy but attached. And that is...
Nice. Everyone loves a heavy butt.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Oh, I thought you wanted.
There needs to be somebody who gets shot. There needs to be someone to take the bullet. Lenin was the victim of an assassination attempt, and it really changed the course of Soviet history in a lot of ways, because it was when Lenin was shot that things started to fly apart and relationships started to fray, and new relationships based solely on opportunity started to form.
Yeah.
And you see this breakdown of relationships because Lenin was what held all these people together.
So I want to just distinguish, because we've used the word now relationship here a couple of times. And to describe relationship amongst like leaders and leadership, and that's certainly not what I meant at the beginning of relationships. But I do think it's interesting to ask John at this point, because you've made a very strong blanket statement, and as it relates to Lenin and Mao and Fidel and whomsoever. Is there any role for violence then in the revolution, or is it purely an organic relationship where all the stuff happens and we do mutual aid and we disinvest, and we block whatever needs to be blocked and so on? And
this is where I insert once again that the people who tell you that Nelson Mandela was Martin Luther King Jr. are lying to you, my friends who are watching us.
And by the way, even Martin Luther King wasn't Martin Luther King, but go ahead.
Yeah, this is true.
I'd like to stress that I am, how have I put it before? Because I've got to be diplomatic.
Yeah, diplomatic. We'll give you the you need.
As an anarchist,
yes.
I oppose violence, but that doesn't mean that I eschew violence.
Sure.
So I think any revolution is likely to. I don't eschew violence. So in other words, I don't think violence is unnecessary. I think violence is ideally avoided. So I think the problem with violence for me is it crosses lines of consent, right? Obviously, if I punch someone in the face, they obviously don't consent to that usually. I think same as if we shoot someone. So I'm against violence, but if somebody else is crossing consent lines, then violence is necessary.
Right. So the response to
that goes quite far too. That's not just like someone pulls a gun on me.
Well,
that means like if
so let me just say, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm going to stop you. I'm going to say, because right now, I am the victim of violence, I say. And by the way, not just me, but especially Black people are actively under active violence. In the United States, it may be different because we have the carceral state, which is different than the UK. But in the United States, there is currently active, ongoing. What'd you say?
I said we're on the way. Like,
yeah,
you'll never approach the police state we have, because your police aren't armed and you don't have the carceral. Right now in Hudson County, by me, they released. They were forced to release the ICE prisoners. So the police are actively on the street making arrests to fill the jails so that institution is full. And the immigrants were left out. So they have like 250 beds. They will in the next 90 days fill that with Black people and poor people. So I'm engaged in active violence today. So I just want to put that caveat out. You can finish what you say, but to me, violence is an ongoing state.
I mean, as a disabled person in Britain, I also undergoing violence and have been for my entire life really, but especially in the last decade and a half or so. There's been a concerted effort by the state to vilify disabled people and basically claim that we're all scroungers and that we're dragging the state down and all that sort of business, and we're too expensive and we should probably be cold. And then a virus came along and killed 140,000 of us. So
you know who else said that? Hitler said that.
Yes, I know. Like the job centers here, it's not what it sounds like. It's not a place where you go to find a job. It's a place where you go to get beaten to find a job, basically. Our job centers have a slogan, which is making work pay, which it doesn't sound too bad until you suddenly understand that it's basically the same thing as work will set you free. It's exactly the same slogan.
Well, yeah.
Let me bring you back to the point. So you said
Yeah.
doing violence to me. So I didn't want to interrupt you that badly. I just wanted to set a definition where violence isn't just somebody. If somebody starts, if the right wingers are surround my house and start to call me a dirty Jew, I got to shoot them back. I believe that there's an active condition right now, but I'm really interested in you completing your assertions about sort of where violence fits in.
So, like, I as far as I'm concerned, also it's important to define violence. So violence isn't just slapping people or shooting people or setting someone's house on fire or things like that. Violence is also how we speak. So I could do a violence to you right now by using a slur. You could do as violence to me by using a slur, or you could be violent by triangulating so that other people hate me. You could be violent by gaslighting me, and so on and so forth. There's a whole array of violence. And as such, violence is integral to a revolution, but not necessarily in the ways that people immediately think of. And I don't think we have to seek to limit violence, right? But I think that any revolution that is inherently deeply violent is going to be difficult to control. The more violence there is, the more difficult it is to control, and the more likely it is that you'll see factionalization. But that's why the state tries to make it more violent, right? The state will provoke us to more violence.
And this is where I point out that with a handful of exceptions, one of which I'll address in a moment, there has never actually been a nonviolent revolution. Now, people will say, well, Gandhi was nonviolent, but Gandhi was nonviolent, but they sure as heck used a lot of violence against the nonviolent revolutionaries in India.
And most people
Gandhi was nonviolent, but his followers weren't necessarily.
Well, not all of them, no.
And also, people will say that Gandhi actually retarded the and slowed the progress of India's independence, which is rather than accelerated it. So go ahead, keep going.
It's also worth noting that Gandhi was a horrific racist who hated the Dalit in India, and there was a concession on the table that could have advanced Indian independence massively from the British. And he turned it down. He went on a hunger strike against it because it would have handed the Dalit a larger share of power. And he was like, sorry, just
it would have democratized. It would have democratized a large section of Indian society.
So that was violence, right? He was carrying out racist violence against other people while he was spouting off about being nonviolent.
Let's let Chris continue with his assertion.
So with this in mind, even accepting the Ben Kingsley version of Gandhi, there's a whole lot of violence used against the nonviolent protesters. That was not a nonviolent revolution. The nonviolent protesters were violently attacked and in many cases killed. So when we talk about nonviolent revolutions, we're just talking about people being targeted by violence and not shooting back, which a famous American once said only works if your enemy has a conscience.
Yeah. No, I don't think that that's what John's saying. I think John's articulated his position pretty well.
Oh, definitely. I agree.
There's not a Super Bowl. I think what you're also presenting some discourse against is this idea that there's a Super Bowl of violence, and following the Super Bowl of violence, that everything is transformed, which a lot of people who are, sort of orthodoxly Leninist or Maoist believe is going to happen. We're going to hang all the landlords, and then everything's going to be hunky-dory.
The revolution in South Africa still isn't finished because the African National Congress stopped being revolutionary to assume liberal power.
And there was a lot of, I think, to John's point, there was a lot of cult of personality stuff, which created a problem with Winnie Mandela, and the whole, post.
The biggest
ANC stuff. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the biggest problem, and I still maintain this. There was a desire to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the quote unquote civilized Western world that led to South Africa remaining a liberal state and simply becoming a liberalized liberal state as opposed to an anti-liberal liberal state. Liberal for some, but not others.
So I think one of the the things that comes out of this discussion, and I like to underline this a lot, which is, John, you said, well, not yet. And I think it is worth noting that the moment we're in today is not like previous moments, and that you can't measure the difference just by chronology, because it's a logarithmic function in terms of speed of change. So I think that what's happened in the last 20 years could be equivalent to a previous century in terms of transformation of capital power, class, climate, social identity, blah, blah, blah. So I think that is a worthy point to consider. For me, as we get to a couple of hours and I start to think about, me logging off, you guys do as you want, is I would come back to this notion that as much as people may resist it, I believe that there is an underlying revolution of personal metaphysic to get people unaddicted from the idea of autonomous atomistic identity.
Yes.
Understanding more and more, which, by the way, is simply scientifically true, that I actually don't exist without you. I don't exist without the earth. I don't exist without the sun. I don't exist without where I am geographically, without my parents' DNA, without my friendships, without a medical, all these things. So I'm unique. I am an individual, but my individuality is not something inherent to me because of my integument and name. And what makes me individual is the particular constellation of relationships into which I fall.
Yeah.
So Lenny Liebman is Lenny Liebman because his parents are, I don't want to help the identity thieves, these two particular people, a Holocaust survivor and a woman whose dad blew up the Tsar's railways. I grew up in the midst of the Imperium. I started off very short, and then after late development, I all of a sudden grew up. I ran in with a certain crowd of people. I read certain books. I had certain friendships. I had certain experiences. One of them was in Tito's Yugoslavia. One of them was in a hash factory in Morocco. Another one, So I am uniquely me, not because I was born with this integral self, but rather because from this integral self, a bunch of relationships hung, which means I can be changed by others. And this is, I think, where what John's philosophy is really important, and that I can gain some intentionality, right? The relationships I entered into between the time I was 0 and 25 or 30 were accidents that happened to me. But we can transform ourselves by transforming who it is we're in relationship with. And that's revolutionary, because for me, I have chosen to be a class trader. I have chosen to be a race trader, right? I that's what I identify at. It's difficult, but it's an intentional revolutionary choice, and we can all make revolutionary choices. And those revolutionary choices are our relationships, rather than do I pick up this weapon or do I read this book and agree completely with it.
And even if it ends up being a matter, and I don't think this is how it would happen either. I see a lot of different scenarios in my head and don't know which of them will come to pass. But if it ended up being an actual literal civil war between them and us, however you want to define it, then that's going to be built on relationships, and on the relationships that move people to take up arms for something better than what we have,
or to choose a side. Yeah,
I think the problem though with that again is that I think I found a better way to articulate it, which is that particularly as a disabled person, the idea of like armed insurrection is alienating.
Yeah.
So if we have an armed revolution, civil war type scenario, then what happens is people like me get shoved to the margins again.
Yes.
I would not be important in the revolution. I would be dead. So like that's a very high probability is I would be amongst the first casualties, because people like me would be rounded up and people like me would be unable to resist.
I
Although I'd
totally
actually
get
resist
that.
and be killed resisting, but that's besides the point.
I don't know. I have a job. I have a job for you. I have a job for you in supply chain management. So man, I got your back.
I'm basically a process architect, so like
Exactly.
maybe I'd be kept alive for that reason. Who knows?
Listen. When
but
the
like,
when Allies did D-Day, Eisenhower never fought in the war. He was a process architect. Okay, that's what I.
yeah, I mean, another word for process architect is strategist. So, like, probably I would have a role
like,
in the war, but let's not admit that when they can hear it.
Douglas
But people like me broadly would be marginalized, right? And it's
Sure.
not just disabled people. It's anyone who our current society views as weak, right? Those people would be pushed aside. That means women, trans people, certain kinds of black people, particularly black women, and like.
But those are exactly the people who are going to be rounded up anyway.
Yeah, but my point is not that. My point is that by the time the revolution ends, those people are still marginalized. All of the people who are heroes are people in the groups who were already in groups.
And that's why
fundamentally changes.
I would probably take issue.
That's why I believe the leaders need to be black here in America.
Yeah, I would also probably take issue with the fact that, especially with the history of civil rights movement in the South, that black women don't pick up guns and shoot people. But
no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that by and large, people perceive these groups to be weaker, and so those people won't be pulled up into positions of leadership unless they excel in ways that stand out more than people in other groups,
or unless they're already the leaders at that point. Which is a whole different argument in another place and for another place in time.
That's kind of why I prefer to advocate for a kind of revolution. I mean, I know people think it's a slower kind as well, like the consensus-based revolution where you build relationships with people and people build relationships with each other and it ripples outwards. But there's a book, I can't remember the name of the book, by Orwell, and essentially what it was about was when he went to Ukraine, and he went to Ukraine because he wanted to witness a society in transition, and he was very excited about it. And he wrote about this before he went, and then he wrote a book afterwards. And if you read the two books, it's fascinating because he goes to Makhnovia believing he's going to find a society in transition, and what he actually finds is a society that has already transitioned. They are already living in the way that they've chosen to live, if you see what I mean. So he goes there and he finds, and it's 2 years since the revolution began. So in just 2 years, they pivoted their entire society. And I think it's important to remember that when you have consensus, when everyone agrees, things change immediately.
It is also important to understand that the reason they call it Makhnovia is because there was still a leader. And one can argue that his actual degree of power varied in specific degrees, but what is important to understand is that he defeated the White Army for the Bolsheviks. And that was very specifically an act of leadership. That was something that only he could do at that point in time. And he did it. Now, what is important about Makhnovia is Makhno then did not say, well, I'm going to stand here telling everyone what to do all the time. He then stepped back away until it was time to do something like that again.
Yeah, but that's quite rare historically. Like people like that are quite rare.
But, I promise you, put me in charge. I will totally step down. Hey guys, I don't know how you're doing on time, but
no, this is actually a good time for everyone to wrap up. John, do you have any final thoughts to close this out?
I think that the something I touched on before, I just want to touch on again, which is that I think that the way to build those relationships that Lenny's been talking about is by pivoting away from utilitarianism, away from this ideal of helping the most people possible, and instead focusing on eliminating suffering wherever we find it, however we can, or acting to the best of our abilities to reach for that as a goal. I think suffering-focused ethics as a sort of rallying cry for what we could sort of call the left is key, because if we all understand that our goal is to reduce suffering, we suddenly all have the same why, and that argument about unification disappears, because we've already unified, because we all agree reduction of human suffering is the goal. And like I don't think it's a big ask, because that was what Marx was so agitated about in the first place. They went to places and they said, look, people are suffering, this is terrible, we need to fix it.
This is worthy of its own show. This is my final thought that I will leave for everyone to ponder in their mind, and then I'll close us out. But who is considered human? And that's where I'll leave it. And the reason I'll leave it there is because I think everyone, even the people we think of as the worst people in the world, tell themselves, I'm going to reduce human suffering by this thing that I'm doing right now, whether what they do is good or bad. I'm not saying they're right or that they aren't even lying to themselves, but I think people convince themselves of that. But when they do, they're excluding some people from that category of human. And so that's what I'll leave everybody to think about. Who is human to you? And I hope you all have a great night. We will tweet at you.
Thanks for doing this, man.
Thank you for coming on, both of you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
My pleasure.